Hey, welcome to the Sequential Artist Workshop Pro Calls. Every week we ask another creator, another graphic novelist to come sit down with us and tell us where they came from, what were the first things they made, what did they make recently, how did they do it, what are they thinking about now, how are they going to move forward, how do they keep going, all those things, career things, art things, feeling things, creative things. Every month it's a new creator, new challenges, new stories. Come check it out. Come sit down with us. You can sit down live for some of these calls by being a member of our groups. You can find us at learn.sawcomics.org. Come check it out. Come be a graphic novelist with us. Come join us on the socials. Sometimes it's Comics Workshop, sometimes it's Saw Comics. Either way, come check us out and welcome. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. Bishakh, thanks for being here too.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I get kind of emotional because I've known you so long and I've liked you for so long that I'm just like,
Oh,
oh,
thanks,
Chuck's
Tom.
here. But but you're also such a spectacular cartoonist, and we're really excited to hear anything that you have to tell us. I saw a teeniest preview of this presentation, and I just sort of greedily wanted you to come here and show it to our students. So I'll just tell everybody. Uh, I think we're all in for a treat, and I'm just going to shut up. So, Bishak, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks to Sequential Artist Workshop for having me. Um, I guess I won't talk too much about myself because what I have to share with you will probably explain more about who I am and what my practice is like than I can do an introduction. So let me share my presentation with you. Um, Is that showing up for everyone?
About to. Yep.
Okay, super. All right, so this is a um, sort of brief-ish survey of my work and my practice in various fields, primarily comics, because that's what we love to talk about, but in a sort of take the path to comics being a sort of convoluted one. And the way I'd like to, sorry, the way I'd like to frame these images from my work is to talk to you about a question I had for myself, and that this sort of structures the way I have been thinking about why I make comics, why I've been drawn to art, and what it has to do with who I am. And the question for myself I had was, why do I seem to have this thematic obsession and fixation with the idea of migration and travel? Um, and I find myself drawn throughout my life, even as a child, to ideas about travel, markers and documents about travel, and spaces that have to do with travel, and like airports, train stations, um, these kinds of liminal spaces that I've always been very interested in and have a sort of like aesthetic draw for me. So I wanted to find out what that was about. And so a lot of this is an investigation into questions I've been asking myself about what it is that has drawn me to this kind of imagery, these kinds of spaces, and wanting to write about them. And this is a kind of dumb diagram that I wrote for myself or drew for myself about what these ideas of travel and migration might have to do with my upbringing, and who I am today. Namely, what does travel, movement, displacement have to do with being trans? Um, what kinds of questions have I asked myself as a person who is trans, but also of a South Asian diaspora? Um, what does it mean to look for home and a sense of belonging for someone who has constantly been traveling and migrating? what do comics have to do with that? So these are questions I've been asking myself, and these are kinds of I'll attempt to answer some of these questions by going through my history of approaching comics. So I would argue right off the bat that my history with travel and migration started even before I was born, and started with my folks and with their grandparents and entire legacies of people from the South Asian, uh, from the Indian subcontinent, let's say, from South Asia. My folks were Indian, so they grew up in India. And I think the condition of having grown up in India at a certain time necessarily means that you're already always displaced. And what I mean by that is that India, um, for my parents, was a place of displacement and partition. As many of you know, India was carved up in 1947 into Pakistan, what was known as East Pakistan and India. So I'll get to that a little bit later, but already for people from that area, there's a sense that you are born into or are historically displaced as a consequence of politics. One displacement that follows this kind of historical displacement happens with my folks who were originally from what was known um, as East Pakistan, and in 1971 became Bangladesh. Um, the thing is, in 1947, since they were Hindus, and East Pakistan and Pakistan were Muslim majority countries, my folks were forced to travel from their homes in what was known as East Bengal to West Bengal, where it was safer for Hindus. There are also migrations of Muslims from West Bengal to East Bengal, where it was safer for them. And the whole history of this kind of movement is quite a bloody one. So within India, they're already displaced, right? On top of that, my dad was with the UN. So he was moved as part of his job to Ethiopia, um, which is where I was born. So I feel at this point that I'm like doubly displaced, as were my parents, right? They're in a new country, far away from home, and they have already started on the process of being displaced and migratory themselves. And yet again, once things went down in Ethiopia, the UN made us relocate to New York City, which is where I am now, in Brooklyn, but we moved to Manhattan. So this is displacement number 4 for my folks, probably displacement number 2 for me. But you can see where I'm going with this. My family history seems to have been one that was loaded from the start with this idea of movement, travel, and displacement. So for folks like us, right, people from India and Pakistan and Nepal and Sri Lanka who have to move as part of their ways of living, you begin to ask yourself, or at least I did at some point, what does home look like, right? Does it look like the picture on the left, which is me and my mom and my cousins? You can see I've sort of inherited sort of a legacy of hair from these relatives of mine and my mom. And on the right is a picture of my aunt and my dad in, I believe, Baltimore. She had to come here to study at the graduate level. So there's a history of this kind of movement in our family, and you begin to wonder at some point, if you're here long enough, where is your home, and what does, more importantly for me, what does that home look like, right? And you kind of have answer that question in many ways. One way of finding a sense of stability amongst all this displacement, for me at least, was to draw comics. These are some comics. I didn't draw these, but I was in a little gang of kids who drew comics in the third grade. And we kind of did it without really thinking. We did it very organically and naturally. And for us, I think it was a very grounding practice, even though we didn't know what that word meant back then. For me, comics have always been a kind of home, and gave me a sense of grounding. These are the comics that were read to me and that I read as a child, and pretty much cemented my visual and linguistic vocabulary from a young age. Some of you may know these. I think Tintin and Hergé's work was the most important to me growing up. It's something that my parents read to me as a child before I could read. So I kind of blame them for becoming an art comics artist. I'll just say also Hergé is deeply problematic. So I want to acknowledge that, but I won't get into it too much at this point. But which is to say, comics have always been part of my youth, part of my growing up, part of my legacy, something my parents bequeathed to me without really knowing it. And it's something I've always been interested in. Beyond the third grade, I continued to draw comics into my teens. These are some early works that I was doing in high school, where I thought like I kind of refused to do inks because I thought graphite and pencil gave the comics a more ethereal nature, but the truth is I just didn't know how to ink. So there you have it. On my road to trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, I think I felt another sense of displacement, which as you'll see, at every movement or displacement comes with it a sort of push and pull. So it's sort of me fighting against this sense of being shifted from a stable ground into the unknown. And for me, it was going to college, this, second or third or fourth displacement, where I didn't get to study art or comics or drawing. Instead, I was in biology on my way to becoming a doctor, which was not going to happen. But I sidestepped that by going into an interior design program, figuring that if I had a sort of facility with drawing, I could use that and parlay that into interior design, which at the time involved drawing by hand, which in turn I parlayed into my work in graduate school, which at the time I thought was what I was going to end up doing. I studied architecture after I graduated from college in interior design. And this was the sort of like stability I was aiming for, mainly to please my folks. I had a facility again with drawing, which I could use in my architectural practice, but this is all, these are all remnants of a different time when people drew by hand, right? So it made sense to me, and it was something I was good at, but did not make sense to me the more I immersed myself in the field, and the further I felt a sense of displacement from where I had started. Nevertheless, I was able to use my hand, my pencil, and the tools that we use in comics and cartoons to make our work in my work in architecture, and I really enjoyed drawing by hand as part of my academic architectural practice. I also enjoyed exploring 3 dimensions, which you kind of don't get to do in comics, but I think the byproduct of that is I felt a sense of understanding form, space, volume, perspective, interior, exterior, and I felt a sort of facility with representing those things, thanks to my immersion in architecture. I did sense at some point that I was moving further and further away from what I was probably, yearning to do all my life, which is comics. So again, there was a sense of push and pull because while I was studying architecture, I attempted briefly to bring comics back into the space of architecture. So this is a excerpt from a comic I did in grad school where while I was at the University of Cambridge in the UK, in which I was presenting a building that I had designed, but instead of drawing just sort of straight up architectural drawings of the space, I created a comic in which two characters were walking around the building that I had designed. And in so doing, creating a narrative within the building, I was able to show the building itself, but to inject it with a sense of narrative and purpose and life, which is something you just don't get with most architectural presentations. So I thought that was kind of novel back then, but it seemed to not go over very well with the architectural professors, but who cares about them? Those days are gone. But I could think you can see like how this might then sort of uh, translate into my later work, which we'll see later on in this presentation. I was starting to move further and further away from things that had to do with art and comics and drawing in my professional practice. I practiced in New York for far too many years in a semi-corporate environment, and it really depleted me, and it was fairly soul-sucking. This is the kind of work I did there. Some of which, had some like cultural interest, but a lot of it was very difficult and, involved being in a very difficult working environment. These are some of the interiors I did as an architect. I enjoyed doing these. These are digitally produced, but still have a sense of the hand in them in the sense that they're not kind of over rendered. There's a sense I did these in Photoshop, and there was a sense that I was like kind of manipulating these spaces the way I would have drawn them instead of having sort of overwhelming algorithm generating these interior spaces, right? Um, at some point after maybe 10, 12 years in the field of architecture, I started to feel that there was an inflection point. There are several things that led me to that point. Um, I'll get to those in a bit, but I think while I was approaching that point, I still felt that sense of the push and pull. Um, and I think all of that had to do with my mom becoming sick in about 2000. And yet another displacement, number 5 or 6 at this point, in which we had to move my mom back from New York to India so that she could get the care that she needed um, as she was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. So me and my brother moved her back there. And for them, for my mom and dad, this was yet like maybe the final displacement for them. But for me too, emotionally and, psychologically, I felt like losing them losing my only family in America was putting me further out to sea. Um, Eventually, mom and dad, uh, well, they shuffled off their mortal coils in India. And this is probably when things really started to change for me. Um, I felt without the sort of parental burden hovering above me that I could finally let go of a lot of stuff. So I quit my job in architecture. Um, I started to grow my hair out. I started to understand myself more as who I really was, and I started to draw comics again, uh, for for real. So this for me was a kind of epiphany, right? I felt like without them, um, without their presence and without their sort of super ego and conscience governing me, I felt like I could take a chance to go back into comics and see if I was any good at it. So around this time, I was starting to also figure out stuff about gender, which is to say, I knew I was not a certain, the way I had been raised and socialized, but I didn't know what kind of um, gender I was supposed to be participating in and what, how much I was involved in being queer. But I knew that something was up, right? So I think what I did was I used comics as a way to investigate that. And so I did comics that had to do with queerness, and I submitted work to a variety of queer anthologies, still not knowing exactly what kind of queer I was. But I think writing and drawing these stories was a way for me to explore those questions. So these are two excerpts from two comics that I did. The one on the left is from The Other Side, which is a collection of queer paranormal romance comics. And the one on the right is from Beyond Volume 2, which is a collection of queer science fiction and dystopian fantasy comics. Um, I also started to reach back a little bit when all of this was happening without my folks, kind of alone in New York, to reach back into investigating who I was, not only in terms of gender, but in terms of culture. And I started to think about the cultural and religious legacy that my parents had left me. Um, as I mentioned, my parents were Hindus. I will add a caveat to that later on, but I won't get to it just yet. Um, and so I was raised a Hindu, and I was brought up with images of very powerful and fierce Hindu goddesses. We were surrounded by these images in our house, and I think that really did something to me. I think you know where this is going, but what I realized was the sort of that these images of the divine feminine uh, were beginning to inform who I was, because they were so much part of my visual and cultural legacy, right? I think this is what all started to come together at some point, probably around 2014 or 2015, when I realized I was trans, which is to say, I mean, no, which I still am. I realized I was a trans femme, a trans woman. Um, and all of this happened around the point at which I was asked to contribute to this book, which is We're Still Here, a great anthology of all trans comics, edited by my friends Tara Avery and Jean Thornton, who I'm going to see in about 5 hours for a drink in Brooklyn. Um, so I was asked to contribute a story to this, but I also did the cover for this, which was a huge responsibility for me at the time, being a newly hatched trans woman, right? But it turned out really well, and I think it really helped me to understand who I was and to have a sense of validation about myself. And yeah, if you, as I understood myself, I still asked myself this question that I brought up at the beginning. What does home look like for someone like me, for a trans person of the South Asian diaspora, right? Um, Around this time, I was also exploring the medium of comics, but expanding from that a little bit. I started to, well, at this point, you can see I've already, I figured out how to use to use ink and a brush. Um, but I was exploring color too. And so I started and which I still do, I use watercolors as my primary medium. And what that involved was not only doing watercolors for comics, but also breaking out into paintings, some of which overlap and mingle, and the two practices seem to inform each other. This is an early-ish piece in which was published in an anthology called Dream Another Dream, um, which was taking inspiration from Winsor McCay and Little Nemo, in which we wrote our own stories, one-page stories, which are, I mean, printed at sort of broadsheet size, so about 17 by 22-ish. And uh, I won't go into Winsor McCay too much, but you know, I think most of you know Little Nemo, and this is taking inspiration from that, but also channeling some of my interest in architecture, but also the sort of trauma that I felt from being an architect, and I was trying to use the medium of comics through watercolor and ink and drawing to try and exercise that trauma and to understand where I was in terms of uh, my artistic practice. Was it in between architecture and comics and art, right? And I think I did this with a lot of my painting work, which I consider a parallel practice to my comics work, and a way to channel all the energy that I had as an architect, um, which was based around drawing, right? It was not based around learning to build buildings, which I still don't know how to do because I just lost interest in it. But what I was good at was drawing, and I still had an interest in representing and exploring ideas of three-dimensionality, of interiors, of movement and perspective, bodies in space, interiors and exteriors, the ability of architecture to approach the kinetic and the place of the body within that kinetic architecture. So these are some pieces that I continue to do as part of my painting practice. And you can see overlaps with my comics work, but also with my legacy of architecture. I've also started to combine ideas of cartography, landscape, architecture, and urbanism into these explorations that I do as part of my painting practice, which will show up later on in my comics practice, as you'll see.
Hmm.
Um, I think things really came to a head for me in about 2018 all the way to 2020. 2020 was an eventful year for all of us, but that's when my first two graphic novels finally came out. Lucky me. I one of which was this book, Spellbound, which is uh, a memoir of sorts. My friend Adam calls it a displaced memoir, which I think is a pretty apt description. Um, a memoir about my growing up, and a lot of it encompasses the things I've just been talking about. Growing up in New York, having to go to architecture school, um, the death of my parents, and I think most importantly, giving up architecture on the road to understanding myself as an artist. So you see on the page on the left, me starting to do just launching myself into my career as an artist, not really knowing where it was going, but taking a risk after having quit architecture to do what I thought I knew I was good at, right? But it's also an exploration of things that I had also been mentioning, movement, travel, my parents' legacy and history of travel are sort of hybridized cultural influences. In New York, for example, on the very corner top right is an image of me and my dad at a fish store in Chinatown. Just so you know, Bengali is like me. I don't do this anymore, but we eat a lot of fish. We're known as like massive fish eaters. So we'd go to Chinatown. My dad would force me to go with him to Chinatown to get fresh fish. And he did this every week, so to the point where the Chinese fishmongers started to learn Bengali from him, and they would greet him in Bengali, and he would respond to them uh, right back, right? Very New York moment for me in the 80s. I should also mention that this is a displaced memoir because I started drawing it without wanting to draw myself. So I created this alter ego named Anjali to play me. Um, so the problematic part of this is that she is a cisgendered woman. Uh, I'm a transgender woman. But this is something I didn't understand when I started this project. However, doing the project made me understand more about myself. So making the comic ended up informing who I was. And I think a lot of you might relate to that. Like just writing something or drawing something then begins to shape who you are as you're doing it, right? Um, in in Spellbound, I the story is that I quit my job to work on a graphic novel which is not Spellbound, but actually is this book, which is my first graphic novel, which also came out in 2020 from Feminist Press, called Apsara Engine, which is a collection of 8 short stories that I had been working on for a while. Um, some of these were mini comics that I did in in the aughts, I think, um, and a bunch of which were longer form works that I did when I quit my job. So my task, my mission, and my little gamble for myself when I quit my job was to create this book, right? And to do that, I sat down at my desk and I wrote and drew about 80 new pages of work. So longer form stories than I was used to. But I figured this is what I needed to get a certain kind of heft to the book, right? A lot of the stories have to do, again, I started these stories before I came out as trans or queer. But you can note what I noticed in the stories themselves is that each one seems to have a thematic undercurrent of queerness to it, right? For example, this one, which is very conversational, very dialogue heavy, is about 2 Indian women who go out to dinner. And it's pretty much just a conversation until they move on and they go to different environments. But it is very much an ongoing kind of sustained dialogue between 2 women. And that's a challenge I set for myself because I'd never seen that in a comic before. Um, as the story goes on, there are elements of queerness that are bubbling up like under the surface. Uh, they never really come out like with full force because this is how I was feeling at the time. And so the story reflects my own kind of hesitation with saying that I was queer at the time. So it's very much a document of a process and of a time. Some stories that I had done throughout the years, which I collected, but then redrew when the book was finally sold. A lot of which also have to do with questions of identity, of exoticism, of Orientalism, of what it means for people to be immersed in a culture, but also displaced from it. And also, I was reaching back into my architectural roots, right? It's looking at how to bring architecture back into the space of comics. When Feminist Press bought this book, they asked me, and by this point I had come out as trans, so they asked me to if I wouldn't consider writing a an 8th story, which was more explicitly trans. And I'm glad they did ask me to do that because it really fully reflected who I am now as opposed to who I was. So I created this story, Swan Dive, which in a way is a precursor to a lot of stuff that I will touch on briefly, in the sense that it is about transness, but it's also about cartography and about the power of the imagination, the power of drawing, um, and the power of collaboration for trans people to imagine spaces that they can fully inhabit as people of a diaspora and also people who in a sense, might be displaced from their own uh, originary sense of gender, right? So a lot of the story has to do with like two people drawing a map in which they imagine spaces that they can, imaginary spaces that they would like to concoct out of their own memories and archives in which they are fully themselves, right? And a lot of this has to do with like bits and pieces that I've extracted from my own cultural memory. So things like vegetable markets in India, um, open sort of verandas and terraces, the sound of a harmonium. I've been accused of a kind of nostalgia and trying to represent these spaces, but um, I think it's a little more complicated than that. I won't get into that right now, but something to keep in mind if you want to launch a critique at me. They also has to do again with the idea of drawing as a tool, right? Drawing as a tool to unleash the imagination. The pages that end the story break out of the sort of panel grid of the first, let's say, 38 or 36 pages of the story and suddenly become this more double page kaleidoscopic double spread, right? In which architecture, cartography, body, comics, language are all fragmented, but also fluidly kind of threaded together. Again, this is an attempt on my part to stitch together all the things, including architecture, that I'd always been interested in, but in the space and the page of comics. So it brought me to, having done that last story, I again asked myself in my 40s and 50s, why am I still interested in these ideas of movement and travel and migration? What does that have to do with being trans and being part of a South Asian diaspora? You know, these images of maps, movement, liminal spaces show up both in Apsara Engine on the left, um, and on the right in Spellbound, right? These images of airports, of these threshold spaces, of the space of the interior of an airline, of an airplane. The sense of like never being kind of grounded, right? And I think what I started to go back to bring back this diagram is that all of these ideas, being trans, being a member of a diaspora, this legacy of travel and movement are all kind of tied together in a very specific way, but also a very kind of generative way. And I think what I started to do was reflect on language as a tool to understand how those things are threaded together, right? So I started thinking about the word transgender, and the prefix trans, right? How trans means in its sort of like most if you bring it to its essence, it's like crossing a border, right? So you think about words like transatlantic, translation from one language to another, crossing a border, transportation, moving from point A to point B. But it can also, I think, have a sort of more three-dimensional quality to it in the sense of words like transcendence, right? It's not necessarily it's not a linear movement from A to B, but transcendence, I think, is a sort of growing, a sort of blooming, right? And translucence, which is, I think, really one of my favorite words, and has to do with light and not necessarily with movement. So I started to think about trans, right, as a prefix, which brought me to thinking about other words that had to do with movement and migration and travel. And I started to think about um, words that had to do with the Hajj, right, in Islam, which is the movement of the pilgrimage to Mecca, which is one of the sort of five pillars of Islam. To Mecca, if it's like one of the things you have to do in your life as a Muslim. So Hajj means, right, the pilgrimage to Mecca, but it also means just to set out for a place. The verb hajja also means to go, but as I started looking into this a little bit more, I've also found that there is a sense of the word which means to repair, which I thought was really interesting. And bound up with these sort of linguistic roots is hijira, um, which is Muhammad, peace be unto him, his departure from Mecca to Medina. Um, and this not only means flight to a place, but a sort of sense of exodus and escape and movement from one place to another into a place of safety, right? I think a place like Mecca is a deeply spiritual place for Muslims, but also gives one a sense of stability, grounding, and safety. And what I realized, linguistically speaking, thinking about these words was that it is probably, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the same root as hijra, which is a very specific community of South Asian trans women, right? Um, I don't consider myself that because it's very culturally specific and geographically specific. But I found that the roots of the word to me provided a sense of comfort, right? That there was a sort of lineage in the linguistic roots of trans people that has to do with not only movement from one place to another and displacement, but added to it are these other senses of the word, right? Pilgrimage, a sense of like movement towards the divine, perhaps, but also a sense of like repairing yourself, of going someplace to find solace and comfort. And more importantly for me, a flight, an exodus, an escape into safety and into a sense of home. So I think this is what has brought me to this idea that like the sense of travel and displacement in my life and growing up has always been a kind of um, a consistent oscillation sense of like going somewhere in order to find home and sort of not finding it. Um, and that has sort of defined my life in a certain way. And it's a feeling that sounds kind of dire, but I think has a sort of magic to it. You know, this constant sense of movement has inflected my work and has informed my work and has made it a lot about thresholds and travel. Um, and for me, it again raises the question for a third time, how can a diasporic trans femme find home? Is there such a thing as home? Or is it in the movement, right? If you're interested, this is a story that I did to try and answer some of those questions, which you can find online at eFlux Journal. So that's E-Flux, and then you can Google my name within that. This is a story that I did as a sort of dress rehearsal for answering the question yet another time in what I consider to be the work that may really solidify some of the answers to these questions, but probably will just create a whole bunch of new questions. And that is the book that I'm working on now, which is going to be published by Abrams, God knows when. I'm thinking 2028, just in time for my 60th birthday. Um, and I was just drawing chapter 6 of it before I came on this call. And the book is basically, the premise of the book is that it's a travel guide uh, in the form of a graphic novel. So it's a graphic novel pretending to be a travel guide in the mode of Lonely Planet or, you know, books of that nature, but also has a host or a protagonist who is addressing the reader directly. So in a way, it's sort of emulating travel shows on TV, like, for example, Rick Steves, right? The Rick Steves series of travel guides. Um, and the things that I wanted to explore as part of this book were what travel has to do with just with displacement, both culturally and in the sense of gender. Um, the premise of the book, as I mentioned, is that it's a travel guide to an imaginary city, which I am designing as I go along, um, and is sort of inflected by cultural and visual markers that I grew up with. So it's a mishmash of like um, uh, things that I've sort of extracted from my memories of India and of South Asia, mashed up with like images that I've culled from my travels. Um, the thing about this imaginary city that I've created is that it is a city state in which all the cis people have been exiled. So it's exclusively populated by trans people. Now, before anyone uh, bites back, this is not something I'm saying is a good thing. I'm just saying it's a question I want to explore in the sense of what might a trans utopia look like, right? Is such a thing even possible? Um, is it even desirable? How does it work? And more importantly for me, how messy is it going to be, right? You get a whole bunch of trans people together to run a city and you end up pretty much with a whole series of hot messes, which I can say because I'm trans. But anyway, this book is attempting to answer questions and to bring up further questions related to everything I've just been mentioning, right? These markers of culture are things that are being explored in the book, right? What we've just, I know, come through Thanksgiving, which for me is a very fraught time because it is so much a time defined by tradition and culture and ritual, um, a lot of which are, geographically centered, right? Like I grew up in New York, I grew up with Thanksgiving, but it means very little to me as a person of the South Asian diaspora. We go through the motions, but it has very little resonance for me as a person from originally, with my roots in India. So the questions I wanted to ask with writing and drawing this book are what are my own traditions and cultures as someone who's never lived in India but may go to visit, um, what does it mean for someone like me who is trans and diasporic to attempt to invent or grasp at a sense of culture, tradition, and ritual? What are the things that can start to ground us in those traditions, which may be queer? Queer people do this all the time. They invent their own culture and their own sense of tradition in order to ground ourselves, right? So the book explores a lot of these things. As I mentioned, there is a guide who is guiding you through the book, who is trans herself and is a sort of stand-in for me, who is exploring the city where she kind of doesn't belong, because she's from outside. So she's come in to explore the city and present it to you, the reader. Um, but she's also not at home in the city, right? So the more she gets into the thick of these, into the weeds of what are the specificities of this city state, the more she's feeling displaced, and the more she starts to wonder to herself, like why she's doing what she's doing, which is to take part in this comic, right? In the story. And you start to wonder, who is she talking to? Um, why is she doing what she's doing? Um, and what is this book about, really? As the book goes on, these conceits of it being a travel guide start to fall apart. Um, so in a sense, the book starts to collapse under its own conceptual weight, right? Because a graphic novel is not a travel guide. So as she starts to unravel psychologically and she starts to question her own part in this narrative, So the book starts to fall apart. It's a sort of like self-destructive mechanism. But it's not all doom and gloom. A lot of it has to do, again, with explorations of cities, of bringing architecture back into the space of comics, of exploring a lot of these like hybrid spaces that I've always been interested in. As I say, I'm on chapter 6, so I've got a ways to go, but these are the sort of things that I've been struggling with as I'm not struggling with, I've been wrestling with as I move towards finishing the book, which will take me many, many years. Um, and at the heart of it, I think the question that I asked myself was, what does home look like for people like me? And that's, you know, that's the sort of engine that drives this book. Um, it's a question I sort of ask myself every day. Could home have looked like that on the left? Or does it look like what it looks like for me most of the days, which is on the right, right? There's a sense that I like belong to neither world, and I'm always sort of like moving in between these spaces, and the book and comics in general are a way for me to find myself grounded in a sense of home and stability. Even if I never find a home that has like a physical kind of, you know, walls and windows and a sense of culture built into it, a sense of like a stable core. I think making comics for me has always been that sort of conceptual home and has given me a sense that I know at least one thing that I can do well. Um, and I think even more kind of generally, drawing, more importantly, has always been a practice that has given me a sense of home and grounding, um, in an attempt to answer further, bigger questions about what home might look like. Um, it's helped me to understand my place in my family's legacy, and how artistic traditions that have been part of my family, from India to here, are in my late 50s, still beginning to unfold and blossom. Um, that's where I'm at with this practice, and I'll leave you with a message from some sisters in Pakistan, uh, which I think will resonate with a lot of you and continues to be true to this day. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thanks, Bishak. Please,
Sorry, it got really hot in here. I don't know. I think
um, there's got to be some questions. So if you have some questions, raise your Zoom hand. That'll work. Um, or throw them in the chat if you don't want to ask it. I've got lots. I mean, I took lots of notes.
okay.
Like I wrote little stars where I wanted to ask a question, but I'm also hoping that other people ask questions. Um, I'll just make the casual joke that you're definitely the first person to I've heard say to talk about the trauma of being an architect. You, you wrote that,
Oh,
you said that, and I wrote it down. I was like, oh my God, that's good.
yeah,
So,
don't do it.
but
I mean,
um, but it's interesting. You're I do have I do have a question, but it's a personal one, and if it's
mhm,
not appropriate, let me know. But you mentioned getting into architecture to satisfy your parents, I think, right?
mhm.
Since you weren't going to become a doctor, clearly. Um, but you never portrayed them as overbearing. Was there something implied in how they expected you to have a sort of standard um, job, et cetera, or were they more overbearing or something like that? And
No, they weren't. It's really part of a certain kind of conservative strain of Indian parenting of a certain generation. So it's not overbearing. It's not like they were tyrants or anything. It's just that for kids like me growing up in the 70s and 80s, you're, it's a stereotype. Like you're expected to be a lawyer, an engineer, or a doctor. Uh, and that's just the way it is. It's like it's a sort of like model minority Asian stereotype, which unfortunately is very true for
Mm.
South Asian kids of a certain generation. And for me, architecture was sort of what's the word? Like respectable enough to be tangential to that. Like they were allowed to, my parents
Almost.
were allowed to brag, and they're like, oh, she's going to, well, they would have used a different pronoun at the time. But anyway, since I got into Harvard, they could accept that there was something respectable to the practice and that architecture in general is a respectable practice.
Yeah.
So they got to say, okay, well, you know, would have been nice if they were a doctor or a lawyer, but good enough, right? Um, but it was also a way for me to be able to draw,
Yeah.
to use my hand, to use all the tools that we use. So in a way, it was sort of like under the radar art making.
Right, right. Yeah, you made that clear. That's really wonderful. Okay, well, Isabel's got a question, and I'll read the chat and see if there are any others.
Okay.
Um,
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes. Hi.
Firstly, thank you so much for this talk. This was like amazing.
Thank
Like,
you. Wow. Thank you.
it was so clearly laid out, and like everything that you were saying was like supported by the visuals.
No, thanks. Yeah, I do try.
But I did have a couple questions, but I think I'll just ask one because like
Okay.
I don't want to take too much of your time.
I'm here.
Um,
Yeah.
but there's so many that I have. I have like this, I don't know if you can see. I have like this whole page of notes that I was
Oh,
taking.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any of them.
And I'm just uh learning that you can process things through art. I'm just learning that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, you had such a winding path to
hmm
making what you actually wanted, be who you wanted to be and do what you
hmm
wanted to do. And like, do you do more than one? I see like a guitar. Like, do you do lots of different creative things, or do you just try to focus on one, or
No, I
how
had
do
to
you do
prune
it
it.
all?
I had to prune it down. I played guitar very badly.
Me
And I
too.
was in a couple of bands, very like, I was in a goth band in the 90s. But
Oh,
these are not things I was really good at. I mean, I knew where I was, where my heart was and where my skills lay, and that was in drawing and in comics. Doing this other stuff was just youthful foolishness and energy. And I still like just, kind of fool around on the guitar, but I think I really had to understand to focus on art in order to be able to do it because there's only so many hours in the day.
yeah.
And that's even more true the older you get. Like there seems to be endless time when when you're younger and the days just go on and summers are boring. But now it's like there's not enough time in the day to do everything you want. So I had to focus on comics. I mean, the liberty I gave myself was to do paintings, like standalone paintings, which have a life of their own and have been shown. And so that's the sort of, again, parallel practice of against the comics work. But I think they're so related that they inform each other, right? So they're not like two separate practices. And the more I learn about watercolors, for example, in my paintings, the more I can apply that to my comics, you know?
That that was so helpful because like I'm 26, but I still like have like that jittery energy of like I want to do everything, I want to do everything, I want to do everything.
Oh, you should. I mean, yeah, don't stop yourself from doing that. I'm just, do it, do it all. Just for me, I had to learn to, start to cull it down to a specific thing. I don't. I felt like I was running out of time, and I really wanted a book to
mm,
be out there I mean, to put it crudely, for a sense of validation, both
Yeah.
as an artist, but also as me, you know. And it's kind of sad. Like I felt like coming out as trans was validated in a way by my art practice, right? Like
Yeah.
because people could realize I was serious about it. Like it wasn't just like something I was kind of
Mm.
dabbling with, right? Like it's all part and parcel of the same thing. So I feel like once the books did well, once my name was out there, I was no longer just a dilettante in terms of like art, but also in terms of gender, right? I mean it.
Yeah.
You know, this is who I am. And yeah, it's all part of like I mentioned in the presentation, there was a kind of epiphany and a kind of essence to this movement that I think whether or not it's like divinely ordained or not, I felt like it was meant to be.
Yeah.
Great.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for answering my question.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry for taking so much time.
No, no, no. We got time.
I love how much you talked about not just processing through drawing and through comics, but like inventing and imagining and creating self and letting your imagination sort of flower through
Yeah.
drawing,
Yeah.
understanding through drawing. It's wonderful to hear all these things.
And I think so much of that, again, like even though I'd regret to some degree having gone through the architecture route, it took me like way out of where was meant to be. I could have gone to art school if I'd been allowed to. I could have studied how to draw comics, how to make comics, but I didn't. Um, I went this roundabout way, but it also allowed me to imagine spaces more fully. And I think that's a really important part, not just of like, drawing backgrounds in comics, but understanding uh, environments within comics, worlds within comics.
Yeah, you said something about the space as kinetic. I'm trying to
Yeah,
find track, but anyway, yeah, yeah. What you do with space now is really wonderful, and
thank you.
I like Earth One. Okay, so two more hands up, Anna
Mm.
and Judith. So let's hear from Anna, and then I'll ask a question.
Well, first, thank you so much. I could gush for a while, but I
Ooh,
really enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
thank you.
I'm curious about the medium that you work with, like that last drawing. I think it was the last drawing you showed brushes and pens and strokes that you painted on the paper, and which I do too, because I'm working in brush and ink and watercolor and things. And sometimes I feel like I am such a dinosaur. Why am I still not working in digital? Like it's so easy.
Oh,
But yeah, would you mind telling us just what makes you stay with the watercolor? It feels like the whole world is going digital. Tell me about, yeah, anything you would like to say about that.
it's again like it's all I know. I tried to understand. I mean, I dabbled in Procreate, and I was like, why am I trying to learn this thing that is emulating watercolors? Like, why do I have to buy brushes in order to like do the thing that I already have brushes for, right? Like, I can use four types of brushes to make a like infinite variety of marks and textures. And why am I trying to like tie myself up in knots to understand how to do that digitally when I have the tools right here? So I just gave up. I was like, I'm not sure what the advantages are for me. And I love it. It's like it's my meditative grounding practice to sit there with a sheet of paper and my brushes and I'm an old lady. I like to like to some degree I'm like I hate to use the word conservative, right? Like because I like these old practices. Um and I mean I will be using some digital tools to like work on my book. Like for example, I think I'll have to do the lettering in post-production because they don't want me to hand letter it. So I have to figure out what I'm going to do with that. But it's in my skill set, so I can do that. But the pages themselves are hand drawn and inked and watercolored. Honestly, because I don't know what else to do with them. This is what I'm known for. Like I don't think my digital, like if I attempted to do anything new, it wouldn't be as good. So I just want to like, do what I'm good at. I mean, that's not a very poetic answer, but
No, that's great. Thank you.
sorry.
Can I ask a sort of geeky tech?
Mhm, mhm.
Do you mind saying like what? Yes, thank you. Wonderful answer. What brushes do you use and what ink do you use?
So these are my inking brushes. I know this is my last remaining, what is it? Series 7, the
Uh-huh.
famous brush, Kolinsky, Sable, etc. But I've moved on to synthetic versions of the same. So this is actually the one that works best for me. It's Raphael um, synthetic sable brush. That seems to hold its point um, more faithfully than some of these others. Yeah, that's the one I like the best. Oh, here's the one. Here's a old Kolinsky that's all messed up. So I don't use that one any longer. But I use other brushes for my watercolor practice. So that was inking. These are my watercolor brushes, just, like 5 of them that do everything I need them to do. And this is the type of ink I use, Dr. Martin's.
Okay.
And I have like really cheap watercolors, just like a whole bunch of them because I don't need to be too, that makes me less precious about it. And I have to say, I don't like, I've never been trained in watercolors, so I kind of don't know what I'm doing, but I would actually love to take formally, like take a class and understand theory and practice of watercolors, but I just kind of did it. This is what we did, like, old people of a certain age, we like kind of just figured it out. Right.
I'm of that certain age too, but thank you. Those are fabulous answers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, Judith, what's up?
Hi, thank you so
Hi.
much. First of all, my father and my first husband were both architects, and I was raised with architecture. Like our idea of a holiday would be to drive everywhere that Frank Lloyd Wright had a house. That was the family vacation. But I wouldn't want you to idealize having gone to art school because a lot of people go to art school. Now, also I'm older, but in the old days, if you wanted to do figurative work and you're at Cooper Union, that wasn't good. You had to do abstract. And if you went to Brooklyn College, well, then you couldn't do printmaking. You know what I'm saying? Now things
Yes, yeah.
are different now. I don't know if people even get taught to draw anymore in art schools. I just don't know.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think that, and a few people have said that you're making them feel better about not necessarily wanting to switch to digital. So that's true. So, I mean, there's no reason why you can't be proud and lovely about what you do. I loved the metaphor of dislocation and diaspora. It seems like there's many levels of memoir, and when people look at their lives and their family histories, there's so much that comes through that's necessarily knowledgeable. I use that metaphor for when I talk about the counterculture and living, say, on a commune in the 70s. And now I live out of the United States, and I realized that I was an expatriate then. I lived outside of the main culture.
Right.
And now it's very similar in a lot of ways. And the other thing I'm very impressed about, because I'm aware of Indian history, but not so much. 1947 and 1948 was, there was a great deal happening in India and Pakistan and also in the Middle East. And I'm curious about, is it still touchy for people from Pakistan or India to talk about the colonization or the dislocation of where they were sent? Because now it's such an explosive issue that you can't even mention it. And I'm just curious, it was happening at the same time, and yet it seems to have been absorbed. Or what happens in Turkey and Armenia. Do you know what I mean? There's history, and then there's what's happening here. And when you talk about what happened to you and you make reference to it, and it's what's interesting is that you would think that being trans would be the explosive topic. But I feel, at least in my world, that's kind of no, who even thinks about it. But I'm curious about all these dislocations that you're saying. And one more thing I want to mention, there's a book called Into and Out of Dislocation by Cecil Giscombe, C.S. Giscombe, who's a poet. And he and I put a book together called Train Music, based on having traveled long distance train rides together. And so this location is very interesting, but I'll send you a note about this book. You would love the book.
Sounds good.
Anyway, I kind of mentioned a lot of things, but I really appreciated hearing everything you had to say.
Thank you.
I hope on the chat it'll be listed how we could see your work and get to it.
Oh yeah, I'll put the websites up.
Okay, so that's it. You
Okay,
could
thank you.
answer or not answer anything you want.
I will just say the legacy of colonialism, of the British Raj, etc., is firmly ensconced in our history. It's not, it's so old that I feel like there are new things to argue about. But the legacy of that, of the partition, of India and Pakistan being sort of grounded in ideas of separating two religions has messed everybody up, right? Because there was a sense at one point that, like, well, this was all a fantasy that India or the Indian subcontinent could ever be secular, but who knows? It might have been at some point. It clearly isn't now. We have a prime minister who is hell-bent on establishing a Hindu ethno-state, and Muslims suffer for that. This is coming from a Hindu, right? There's tensions in the region that are a microcosm of greater tensions in the world. There's a kind of right-wing, conservative, reactionary tendency in a lot of Hindu pockets in the world that ally themselves with really unfortunate bedfellows. So it's all messed up. It's all a legacy of colonialism and of what happened in 1947, but it didn't start there. So these things, have knock-on effects and continue to affect the world in really dire ways. So that is to say, yeah, it's a bigger question, just beyond what happened in 1947, but I'm not, that would take up a whole year and further to discuss. So
As an
I'm just trying.
optimistic observation, my grandson is traveling as a vacation in Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and is following his service in the IDF. And he's 22 years old, and he's an intellectual artist. And he's in Cambodia and Vietnam, which for me, because of my age, that was the killing fields. That was in a way, what people think of as Gaza now. And I have to say, it's kind of optimistic that it became a vacation destination. And I'm thinking about all these places that were once, for the people who weren't there, just horrific. And now it's a vacation destination where people are proud of their past and showing what their textiles are and their foods. And anyway,
things come and go, and horrors pass and are revisited. So it's ever was it thus, I think.
Anyway, I'm very impressed with your work and looking forward to seeing more of it. Thank you
so much.
I put all the links in the chat, so there's 3 or 4 links.
Thank you so much.
Although I should put some direct links to shopping carts for Bishakh. I'll do that in a moment. Bishakh, I have one last question, and it's merely about your process, especially this newest book, because you gave such a thorough rundown of what it's about. yet so it sounds like you've written the entire thing, and tell me if I'm wrong, yet the procedure now is to sort of calmly for 2 years draw this thing. And
Yes.
and because you talked so much about drawing as exploration and igniting the imagination and stuff, I'm wondering how that process works for you. Some of us here, I mean, we all find different processes.
Mhm.
Some of us find need to not separate writing and drawing so much, right? And so the idea of writing something first and then drawing
Yeah.
is kind of difficult for some, certainly for me. So I'm wondering what you found about process, especially about handling a large project like this one.
So this is very different for me. It's my first time working with a publisher like Abrams, who are bigger than my previous publishers. Um, but working with a publisher from the get-go, uh, actually when I sold the book to Abrams, I had nothing. I had a pitch, I had an idea, and by the grace of God, they bought it on the basis of that. It's like it's kind of miraculous. Um, so after it was a done deal, I started writing the script, which is like you say, Tom, it's like uh it was kind of anathema to me because I didn't want to, like, I sat there, um was it the pandemic? I don't remember now, but I sat at my desk and didn't draw. I mean, I drew character sketches and stuff, but I was, for the most part, typing away, like, uh, the sort of stereotype of a writer at their typewriter, kind of banging away at a script. And I was like, this is not what I was meant to be doing, but it had to be done as a way to get to my editors and publishers something in a relatively short period of time that they could then give me feedback on. And that was not going to happen if I had been doing thumbnails, because thumbnails would have taken me twice as long, 2.5 times as long. So within a relatively short time frame, I was able to crank out a script for a 250-page book, which it's not, I mean, as you know, it's not like a novel, a prose novel, because a lot of it is description and dialogue rather than like expository kind of like information or anything, right? So 250 pages of comics does not equal 250 pages of like a manuscript. But anyway, I cranked that out, and that, yeah, it's been a very linear process. So I gave them the script, they gave me feedback, we did a round back and forth of edits on that. And then about, I think, round 3.5 or 4, they gave me the go ahead. And and this is something I would not normally do. I started right into the pencils without doing thumbnails. Um, so here, yeah, I didn't even, and that's not something I would recommend to anybody. I wouldn't recommend it to my students and to long-term practitioners of the medium, like, but I felt like, again, I had enough of a sense of the story that I could just dive in, and then if something was off, I could fix it in a piecemeal way. I could prove to be this could go very, very wrong, but I'm just going to go with it for now because I don't have time. Um, if I were to do thumbnails at this point, this book would not be out until 2030 or something, and I'll be I'll be like incapacitated by then. So I really wanted to be out, and in the interest of expediting the process, I just dived right into pencils from the script. And then I'm going to ink the whole thing and then paint it. And God has helped me.
In that order, you're gonna pencil it, whole thing, ink the whole thing. Wow. Oof.
Did you show
Okay.
them other stuff though? Like you didn't just pitch something, they must have known your work, no?
By that time, my 2 books were out. My 2 graphic novels had been out. So one of my editors is Mariko Tamaki, and she had heard about my work, and was starting a new imprint at Abrams called Shirley, as in Shirley You Just, which is an LGBTQ imprint. And she invited me to pitch them a story based on the strength of my first two books, which is, doesn't happen to everybody. So I was pretty lucky that
Well, and
that
those
they,
books are remarkable and
thank
amazing.
you.
And yeah,
Lucky and
so,
accomplished.
yeah. And so I just put links to those two books in
Thank you.
chat. Please, everybody go. I think we should let Bishakh get back to your book.
Oh, I mean,
chapter
I'm
chapter.
down for more questions if you want, but also I don't know how long this thing is supposed to go. So.
Well, usually 90 minutes is definitely our limit.
Oh, okay.
We did have a question. Ellen asks, but this could go on forever too, I imagine, what the architectural influences were at Harvard during the time you were there.
Oh, God, that's a great question. Very much, it was a sort of residual effect of the deconstructivists. So I don't know if you're familiar with any of these names, but like people like Peter Eisenman, um, Bernard Tschumi. For me specifically, I was very much into Zaha Hadid's work as a woman of that part of the world, a brown woman from I think Iraq, um, and participating in a sort of like man's world in a boys' club. I was very much drawn to her work, and she also did much of her work, early explorations in architecture at the AA in London, were painting based, right? They weren't like necessarily in the world of architecture, they were in the world of paintings, but she used painting as a means of exploring ideas of architecture. And then the other person I was really into was a sort of visionary, what we call a paper architect named Lebbeus Woods, who never built anything, I don't think, but imagined these very dystopian science fiction inflected worlds in his drawings, a lot of which look like, there's a sort of uh, resonance with Mobius's work, like that the two people, even though they're on very, well, quite different fields. There's a sort of dialogue, I think, between the two people that across fields that I found very inspirational. But yeah, it was a lot of like people who are informed by post-structuralist theory of the 70s and 80s. A lot of it is so tired now. It's so dated and just really cumbersome and tedious. Oh, Hayduk also, yes. Absolutely. Hayduk.
I don't think most of his famous buildings were ever built.
No,
He was
they're
a
all very
cook,
conceptual. So
but
yeah,
he used
good
to
call.
babysit for his children.
Right? Um, that's what we grew up with. And then stuff that happened after that, which is much more uh I don't know, freeform was after my time, but I also really admire really blobby, biomorphic, organic architecture that I think was made possible. And I'm a fairly like ensconced in being a Luddite, but I think a lot of these architectural forms were made possible by technology, by um, programs that allowed you to model very complex shapes in 3 dimensions, but also allowed you to understand how to build
Mhm.
spaces like that, right? Which you can, I think, sort of architectural geniuses have done in the past, but it's a very laborious process and it requires a lot of like mental spatial gymnastics. And I think programs like Rhino or Maya and, ones that I have no knowledge of now allow you to imagine and draw and construct spaces much more easily these days. But I just draw them, so I can, this is all I need.
I have a follow-up question, I guess, related to that. You mentioned that the new book is a sort of trans utopia. I know utopia is probably in quotes, or at least
Yeah.
at least there's some irony there or something.
Mhm.
Are you in your creation of the spaces in that book, are they meant to be realistic or inhabitable, or are they symbolic in some ways? Do they get abstract? Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, no, that's I love that. My initial tendency was to make them as fantastical as possible because that's what I enjoy drawing. And then I realized like that would betray the sort of exploratory impulse of the book, in the sense that it would be very easy for me to fall into like visual tropes that are derived from science fiction and futurism and stuff. But what I really wanted to do was to question this idea of what a utopia can look like. So part of the story is like, how did this become a trans city? And the history that answers that question is that in this world, you know, the trans people take over the city and reclaim spaces that were previously used for were sort of vehicles of commerce and capitalism and war, right? So for instance, in one, I think they showed a drawing of this sort of monument, and it's that the chapter is called The Monument. And what happens is that it's a monument to war. It's a sort of like triumphal arch, which these trans people have taken over once they've ejected the warmongers and turned it reclaimed it for other purposes. So they've sort of built these ancillary spaces around this war monument for art, for creating art. Like, so there's a dance studio and an art studio and a batik studio. And all of that is pointed out in this one-page drawing where I get to indulge in a bit of like architectural, you know, frippery. But I tried to avoid making the whole thing a kind of architectural fantasy. It's more the idea of how trans architectures can maybe be about rehabilitating spaces or reclaiming spaces or re-inhabiting spaces that were once purposed for something else, and taking spaces that were dedicated to production of, you know, of overproduction and overconsumption, and to turn them into something completely new. So they are meant to be believable, useful spaces, and I'm trying to restrain myself from making them too loopy. But it is a great pleasure to try and make them as specific as possible visually, you know, to make them legible and to imbue them with a sense of history and weight, but also to give them to draw them in such a way that you understand that they have a new life.
That's great. That's great. I'm really excited. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really want to let you go so you can go finish chapter 6.
I can clean up the litter box and then.
You know, the cat is in Spellbound a lot, and
he is, yeah.
and
I'm misgendering my own cat.
you should all go take a look
At the litter box. Oh, no.
No, at those books if you haven't grabbed them.
Thank you.
They're in the chat, and it's really nice to hear what you're up to right now, and get this large overview, because we all love a through line, to be honest. You know, we love when an artist looks back and says, oh, here's what I've been up to for so long, and here's why I've been doing it.
Yeah.
And that means a lot. And hopefully we can all get there someday, where we have like some understandings. And I know you've even mentioned like those understandings are never solid. You know, you may say, okay, this next project will be the one when I present all the answers, which
my magnum opus.
Yeah, I think you even said something like that, but you know that they'll reveal more questions. But
yeah,
it's great when you can model that kind of clarity for us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks everybody for listening to me.
Yeah, please come off mic, give a round of applause to Bishakh, and litter box, and then chapter 6.
Okay, on it.
And then drinks. Yeah, with
drinks. Yes.
Okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, Bishakh.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye,
Fabulous.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for joining us. This has been a production of the Sequential Artists Workshop, or SAW. You can find us on social media at Comics Workshop and online at sawcomics.org. You can hear about our many courses at learn.sawcomics.org. SAW is a nonprofit and supported by people like you. Learn how to make a tax-deductible donation at the donate page of sawcomics.org. You can join our free community of comics explorers at members.sawcomics.org. Thanks so much for being here.